Good morning and Happy New Year. Welcome to the KDKA-TV Sunday edition. I'm Rick Dayton. Stacy Smith and Ken Rice are away this week. The question is it the beginning of the end or is it the end of the beginning? Talking not only about the end of a calendar year, 2017, but also the approaching end of the first year of the Trump administration. Also the end of a volatile financial year that broke a number of records on Wall Street. Is that glass half empty or is it half full? This morning, the KDKA-TV Sunday edition, we hear from two investment experts about the U.S. economy, about stocks, and what to plan for 2018. Lou Stanislavic is a certified financial planner and founder, as well as chief compliance officer, CEO, and president of Legend Financial Advisors Incorporated and Emerging Wealth. Rick Applegate is a certified financial planner and partner at Cantor Fitzgerald Wealth Partners in Pittsburgh. His Money Talk segments can be heard on News Radio 1020 KDKA's Morning News. David Schrimman, the executive director of the Post-Gazette, also joins us for this morning's discussion. Gentlemen, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yes, glad that you're here. I think the big thing that so many people are talking about is the tax code changes that are coming down. Where do we think that is going to play out? And we've already seen in the city of Pittsburgh questions in Mount Lebanon. Can you not pay early? Things like that. Is that going to make that much of a difference, Lou, when it comes to people's bottom line?
Not really from an investment standpoint, but perhaps you will have some advantage to taking advantage of prepaying those taxes. But we have to remember what will happen in next year's situation. It depends on your income. It depends on your situation. It's really tough to predict.
And it's also tough to predict what the IRS will do. They offered last week an advisory, not a judgment, but an advisory that severely curtails and makes almost all those people in line at the Allegheny County Courthouse having done something that won't have any effect on them whatsoever.
Speaking to that, David, I called a couple of the offices themselves because clients have been asking about the deductibility of these taxes. And to your point about what the IRS last week said is if you don't have an actual assessment of the property in hand, you can't prepay on a presumption of what it might be.
An estimate is not good enough.
Right.
Right. But then again, here in Allegheny County, since we don't have annual assessments, surely there'll be a challenge to that if you know what you paid last year, then you implicitly know what you will pay this year. So there may be, we'll have to see how that works out.
Wait and see how it plays out.
Yeah.
From the personal standpoint over to the corporate standpoint, obviously we have had a run, Rick, throughout this year of record-breaking finishes on the Dow. S&P has done incredibly well, yet inflation has stayed very much in check. Do we anticipate those factors to stay with the rise in the market values and at the same time keeping inflation 2%, maybe 1.9%?
I think you're going to continue to see the market move a little bit higher into the new year, but the fact is that what is more concerning to me in the marketplace, in fact, is the lack of volatility. And with that, the complacency that I see with investors, given the scenario that you're outlining of low inflation. We're not seeing a big adjustment in interest rates from the Federal Reserve's last action in December. So a lot of things that I think would create greater volatility is ahead, I think, as we move into 2018. But I still think that the equity markets are going to be rewarding, more single digit than not, however. And I think it's going to have to be more discerning as to what you buy and how you buy it, as opposed to just indexing.
Gentlemen, what would you consider the chances of a market readjustment of, say, 8, 10, 12, 15% in the next year?
We're overdue. We're overdue. We had an 11% adjustment at the beginning of first 40 days of January of 2016. You're supposed to have a correction about 3 times a year. You're supposed to have, 1 time a year. Dips about 3 times a year. Dip is 5 to 10% kind of thing.
We haven't seen it.
We haven't seen it, and partially that's largely because interest rates have been so low. And if there's not interest rates rising, creating some instability, we're going to probably see a market that will go eventually until it gets too expensive, and then it will eventually correct in itself.
Well, I don't see the 10% pullback. Yeah. I don't see a 10% pullback. I do see the 5 to 10% range. But I think the unknown, that black swan that we don't know about largely, is what might occur with North Korea. Things like that we cannot anticipate that could push it to a 10%.
Because there are no market surges that don't end in a readjustment.
That's right.
It never has been.
That's correct.
Will be.
That's absolutely right.
And so the question, of course, is when, and market timing is always the question. But do you think people should be plowing more money into equities right now?
I think, as I said in my comments a few minutes ago, David, I think they have to be selective. I don't think that just buying the index at these levels makes any sense. I do think we have to start to look for more value opportunities, as few as they are, but I do think we have to look abroad as well. I think that there's still opportunities to the economic differences of what has been developing in Europe versus the United States for opportunities to buy equities. So the U.S. isn't the only game in town.
So are those global markets as strong as what we have seen throughout 2017, or are there weaknesses there that could also impact the markets here?
You're also having in those countries, both in Europe and Japan, they're starting to raise rates for the first time in a long time. And so you're starting to see this adjustment. Yes, their prices are cheaper. Emerging markets are even cheaper. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll always go upward. Okay, it also depends on where the U.S. dollar is. The U.S. dollar kind of drives all those markets over time, and if the dollar is rising, the answer is probably not, especially emerging markets, because they're so affected by commodities.
All right, David, with the amount of time that you have covered Capitol Hill and politics, how much does the new president being in office impact these markets, do you think?
Not as much as presidents say, and surely not as much as people who want to be president say. You know, when President Kennedy was inaugurated, he said, you know, things are just as bad as I said they were. He was surprised to say that. President Clinton was able to take advantage of an economic boom that had started in President Bush's days. President Obama spent the first half of his first term complaining about what had happened under the Bush administration.
What he inherited, right?
Right. How much of this Trump boom is really an Obama boom? Economists and historians will fight about this. Republicans and Democrats will fight about this for probably decades.
Often taking the blame game and pointing the fingers and then also taking the credit the other direction, right? Rick, what are you seeing when it comes to unemployment figures right now, and how much does that play into what happens in 2018? 4%, is that an accurate number?
The 4.1% that we were talking about before, Janet Yellen in her final days as the Federal Reserve chairperson herself in her final press conference indicated that with the tax reductions that she's seeing coming, we might see a drop of unemployment to 3.9% in the year ahead. But 4.1 in and of itself is full employment in this country. And so what we have is a very tight labor market. Ultimately, what could come from that, if the unemployment drops even further, is pressure on wages. And that would be sparking that inflation rate that you talked about earlier.
But hidden in those unemployment rates are demographic variances that are very concerning,
tremendous, yes.
Particularly among millennials who have the greatest stake in the future of the U.S. economy. The things are nowhere near 3.9 or 4.1, and particularly for college graduates, and that is a recipe for a different kind of social volatility.
Well, and I think, you know, in that regard, David, I think that the issue of the tax reform that we're speaking of is with regard to, will the corporate tax reductions really spur hiring, as has been proposed? I don't know that it will, because we've seen a lot of corporations with these tax rate drops. We're talking of a tax drop from 35% to 21%, with the actual marginal rate anyway, historically, of 18.6. So will they really turn around and use these lower rates to hire people? I don't think so.
I don't think so either, because they have been harboring so much cash and not investing over the past, say, 5-6 years.
Agreed. So then what happens with that extra money? Where does that money go?
It goes to dividends.
That's the next question.
It goes
what about
to buybacks,
right?
Okay, and it goes to bigger bonuses.
And mergers and acquisitions.
Right, exactly. So they chase things. None of those activities necessarily benefit anybody in terms of hiring. Okay, yeah, it'll obviously benefit shareholders, but it won't necessarily benefit if this was truly a Jobs Act. It's failed, in my opinion. And, you know, bringing back the cash is great, okay, but again, who's the benefit, all right? They're not going to be putting new factories over here instead of overseas. Until you build those economic incentives like they did in the Reagan administration, shorter depreciation schedules, higher tax credits, and in fact, I don't know if anybody remembers, but back in '81, companies were able to sell their tax credits to other companies to pay down the taxes, and hence you had huge economic stimulation. That's what we need, not what we just passed.
And the Reaganomics, the trickle down, sort of that's what he had preached from the beginning, was that it would ultimately come down to the consumer level. And you're saying you may not see that this time around.
I don't believe you will. And then secondly, as was mentioned, the demographics among the younger people. We might have full employment, but believe me, there's huge underemployment. And so we're not making the progress we had. We're not seeing the demand for wages. We will in certain professions.
But isn't that what Yellen was saying in the last sort of comments that she made before heading out, was that the number may be twice that 4%. It could be actually a more effective unemployment rate of 8% rather than the 4% being reported.
I believe so. I hear time and time again, younger people, yeah, I got a degree in economics or I got a degree in accounting, but I'm working as a waiter, okay? Not to belittle waiters or anything like that, but still, there's a lot going on where these people are not earning income in the profession they've chosen or went to school for, and it's
to say nothing of the
really bad
of the savings rate
situation
and the accumulated savings of people who are 60 and over. That's stunning and horrifying, and that's the crisis next time.
You know, and again, too, one last point on the employment situation. I don't think you can underestimate the impact on employment in this country to the change evolutionarily of this economy in the technology sense. Technology has tremendously changed the numbers of jobs that are out there. So, and that's going to continue to happen. So I think
positively or negatively?
It's going to, well, in one respect, it's positive to the profit lines that we talked about. On the other, it's negative to the opportunities of lower paid jobs. They're going to be replaced constantly. So the opportunities, and we also still see from the 2008-2009 financial crisis of this country, people holding on to their jobs post 65 if they can. You know, they have not quite, in some respects, recovered from that if they didn't take advantage of reinvesting after that and getting back in the market. Many people went to the sidelines and never took advantage of the run-up we talked about earlier.
And many of those same people bought expensive toys they didn't need and have savings of under $100,000 with life expectancies of another 18 or 20 years.
Absolutely right.
And we will talk about what's going on with the consumers and consumer confidence when we come right back. Keep it right here. We appreciate you being with us on KDKA.